Hi, I'm Ollie Wilson. This talks. Hi, my name's Ollie Wilson. This talk's part of an event called Scientists in Congregations at Minster. Each day, we're working our way through the themes in the Bible's creation story. Today, I've got the great joy of looking at plants, but there's a whole series of things happening all this week, online and in person. To find out more, head to Minster's website. So, who am I? Well, I'm a scientist in the Minster congregation. I've been on the PCC, the Board of Trustees here at the Minster, for the last few years. It has to be said, though, my toddler's picking up the accent faster than I am. In my day job, I research climate change and UK plants for a charity called Plant Life, and I'm also finishing a PhD at the University of Reading, looking at these forests in Brazil. For the next little while, I'm going to be talking in praise of plants. I love plants. I think they're great. I'm a full-on plant nerd, and I hope by the end of this talk, I'll have shown you part of the reason why. Plants might just be some of the most important things we routinely ignore. Have a look at these photos. What do you see? Chances are you see a snow leopard here, a spiky lacewing caterpillar here, and a crazily colourful bird, a lilac-breasted roller, in case you're interested, here. But I wonder, do you think anyone looked at these images and immediately saw a sycamore tree with a grey fluffy thing beneath it, a passion flower leaf with one of the creatures whose life cycles it supports, and a whistling thorn acacia tree? Probably not. Some people call this phenomenon plant blindness. I don't love the term, but it is true that plants tend to fade into the background for most people. If you want to see this in action, next time you're watching a David Attenborough documentary, keep track of how many times you hear the names of specific plant species. Unless plants are the focus, and they rarely are, I guarantee they'll be hugely outnumbered by animals. Part of the reason for this is that we've evolved to focus on things that might be dangerous, often things that are colourful, move unpredictably, or look like they could hurt us, not particularly plants. So that's why we see the snow leopard, bitey scratchy, the roller bird, bright, and the lacewing caterpillar, colourful and spiky. Danger signs. They all leap out of these photos at us. But that doesn't make it smart to ignore plants. Consider this one. Be honest, it's already fading into the background, isn't it? You don't want to let that happen. This is a plant called Gimpy Gimpy. It grows in Australia, and like so much of Australia's nature, it's a bit extra. It's in the stinging nettle family, but, well, it's nasty. You don't even need to touch it to get hurt. 20 minutes in its presence will start to damage your nose and your throat. You can wind up sneezing and coughing up blood for days. Its sting has been described as the worst pain you can imagine, like being burnt with hot acid and electrocuted at the same time. A soldier who fell into one while training during World War II had to be strapped to his hospital bed for 3 weeks because the pain was so bad. So, pity the poor officer who used the leaf for toilet purposes. All that said, we shouldn't just pay attention to plants in case they do us damage, not least because plants as harmful as the Gimpy Gimpy are mercifully rare. A far better reason for paying attention to plants is because they underpin our lives, yours and mine, our parents and our kids, in this country and around the world. It's always been true all through the history of human civilizations and the evolution of our species. It's just that for the last couple of centuries, societies like ours have been weirdly removed from the plants we depend on. There might be 400,000 species of plants on planet Earth. Scientists still have tens of thousands more to discover, let alone understand. Of those, I wonder, how many could you name, say, in a minute? You might like to try it. It's an interesting exercise, and feel free to pause me just for a minute to see what you can come up with. This isn't something you can pass or fail. There's no judgment if you struggle. The number you reach isn't the most important thing. What is interesting is which plants you choose and why you choose them. You probably think of some which triggered others, and you get in a bit of a roll. And I bet plants that you use feature a lot on these lists. Maybe plants in your garden, or fruits, or vegetables. But did you know that scientifically there's no such thing as a vegetable? And I wonder, how many plants will you use today? One day, have a go at keeping track. I guarantee it'll be eye-opening. Have a look at the ingredients on a few things in your cupboard or your fridge, and almost everything will have something from plants in it. I thought I'd have a go at this when I was writing this talk. For breakfast, I had some apple juice and a toasted muffin with butter and marmalade. I think there were 7 plants in that. Obviously, there were apples in the juice, oranges in the marmalade, and wheat in the muffins. But there was also sugar from sugarcane or beet, lemons or limes for citrus pectin in the marmalade, and rapeseed oil and soya in the muffins. That day, I also had a drink of squash, blackcurrants, more apples, and a plant-derived stabilizer called cellulose gum. And for lunch, I either had a peanut butter and jam sandwich, peanuts, maybe palm oil, strawberries, more citrus pectin, or I had a ham and cheese and chutney sandwich, which would have been plums, more apples, grapes, sunflower oil, onions, ginger, garlic, and star anise just in the chutney. And these are just the plants that I ate or drank that morning. There were more that afternoon, and then there's the plants that fed the animals that I was using, plus there's cotton in my clothes, wood in my furniture. Plants made almost all the oxygen that's keeping me alive. Plants really do underpin everything. Plants are key to almost every area of our lives. It's not just food. For most of humanity's existence, plant-based medicines have been our best shot at curing sicknesses, and they're still widely trusted and used by people around the globe. In the UK, where we're more used to our medicines coming as packets of white tablets or bottles of sticky liquids, we might think that seems strange, but that would be wrong. In fact, lots of the medicines we use have come directly from plants. You might have aspirin tablets in your medicine cupboard. Aspirin's main ingredient is salicylic acid, and that's naturally found in meadowsweet and willow bark, which people have used for thousands of years as a natural painkiller. Plant-based medicines can cure more than headaches too. Malaria is one of the worst diseases in the world. Every year, it infects more than 200 million people, mostly in relatively poor countries, and it kills hundreds of thousands, most of them children under 5. And essentially all the best treatments we have for malaria are based on 2 traditional medicinal plants. The first is quinine, also found in tonic water, which comes from the bark of cinchona trees, which Peru's indigenous people have long known can treat fevers. The second is artemisinin. A plant called qinghao has been used in Chinese traditional medicine for 2,000 years to treat malaria. This scientist, a professor called Tu Youyou, won the Nobel Prize for figuring out how to make it into an effective medicine, and she did that using a book that was written in the year 340. Some medicines from plants can even tackle cancers. This is part of a yew tree. Scientists discovered a whole family of chemotherapy drugs by investigating yew tree chemistry. Now, those drugs treat breast, stomach, lung, prostate, ovarian cancers, and many others. Another remarkable plant is this, the Madagascar rosy periwinkle. It contains the starting points for a range of cancer-fighting drugs, including 2 called vincristine and vinblastine. You need half a ton of dried leaves to get even a gram of vinblastine, but these 2 chemicals are literal lifesavers. In the 1960s, when they were introduced, survival rates of childhood leukemia were less than 10%. Now, with vincristine in particular at the heart of every chemotherapy regime, they're above 90%. The line between killing and curing is narrow, though. Almost every part of those yew trees is poisonous. Chemotherapy drugs are all highly toxic. It's just that cancer cells are slightly worse affected than healthy ones. Foxgloves, for example, produce a chemical called digitoxin or digitalis. It can help control heart problems, but a slightly different dose poisoned James Bond in the film Casino Royale. This plant produces a chemical called DTC. Through the middle of the 20th century, it was a really important drug for surgeries under general anesthetic, but it comes from a South American arrow poison called curare. In both cases, it works by paralyzing the muscles around the lungs, but crucially, it leaves the heart alone. Plants can cure and plants can kill. Plants give us food, but so far, we're just looking at things plants give us that are on a kind of holdable scale. I haven't even got into the importance of things like wood, for example. But I want to move on to quickly highlight some of the things plants do for us at a scale that's much harder to grasp. Scientists often talk about ecosystem services, things the natural world does that are useful to us humans. So urban trees provide cooling shade for streets and houses, and they filter pollution out of the air. Woodlands prevent soil erosion and flooding. Natural grasslands support pollinators for our crops. Forests, mangroves, and seagrass meadows suck enormous amounts, billions of tons of carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere every year, slowing down the unnatural climate changes that our carbon emissions are causing. Plants help hold our world together. But it's not especially healthy to think of plants' importance only in terms of what they do for us. From a Christian point of view, they matter because they're God's valued creations, just as we are. Plants are amazing on every level. Now, plants can be mind-blowing at an individual level. This is an aspen tree called Pando in Utah, USA. Yep, one tree inside that line. These 40,000 tree trunks are all genetically identical. They're clones of one another, and they come from the same 10,000-year-old set of roots. Pando covers an area that's 8 times larger than Windsor Castle, and it weighs 6,000 tons. It's the heaviest living thing on Earth. Larger and older still is a colony of Neptune grass in the Mediterranean, just south of Ibiza, which is 5 miles across. It could be 100,000 years old. Up until 1964, this was the oldest living tree that's not a clone, a bristlecone pine called Prometheus. Sadly, it was cut down in 1964 by a scientist who didn't know he was killing one of the world's oldest living things. Now the record holder is another bristlecone called Methuselah, which sprouted around 2833 BC, before any of the historical events in the Bible. And speaking of ancient Bible-related trees called Methuselah, this one is a Judean date palm. It was grown in 2005 from seeds that had been preserved in King Herod's palace since around the time of Jesus. There are other exceptional individual plants. Several tree species grow to be taller than 100 meters. The tallest is a coastal redwood in California called Hyperion, but there's also Monara, the yellow Meranti in Borneo, and Centurion, the mountain ash in Tasmania. All of these are bigger than Big Ben or the Statue of Liberty, and they're probably not far off the absolute biological limit for tree height. Much taller, and their water transport systems would fail. But despite their incredible size, we shouldn't get too obsessed with the big things. Otherwise, we might overlook some everyday marvels. This is the top of a dandelion. There's a good chance you recognize it. But did you know that this isn't actually a single flower, but it's a composite head of lots of individual mini flowers called florets? Their natural spiral patterns, in several species in this family, follow and illustrate fundamental mathematical patterns like the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio. And you know dandelion seeds as well? Well, they can drift for more than 90 miles, though exactly how they're so good at flying was a bit of a mystery until a couple of years ago. And when it was unraveled, the answer was an incredible bit of physics that surprised the world of science. Not bad for a plant you'd normally ignore. There are so many other incredible mini miracles I would love to tell you about. This isn't a bullet being fired from a gun, it's a witch hazel fruit spitting out a seed in 9,000ths of a second, 11 times faster than you can blink. Even faster is the Amazon's dynamite tree, whose seeds get launched out at speeds which average 96 and occasionally exceed 150 miles an hour. I could spend ages telling you about pollen grains, their shapes and their patterns, how most of them won't give you hay fever, the fact their shells are nearly indestructible, they can last hundreds of millions of years. Did you know that rainbow eucalyptus trees look like this? Or that other eucalyptus trees try and set their neighborhoods on fire because they and their seeds rise quickest from the ashes? Plants are staggering on an individual level, as I hope you'll now agree. But only to look at the individual level would be a mistake. Plants are no less incredible when we zoom out. There are roughly 3 trillion trees on our planet, more than the number of stars in our galaxy. And some of those trees are entire ecosystems in their own rights. In the 1970s, some scientists puffed clouds of insecticide into the canopies of some trees in Panama. They only did it to 19 trees, all from the same unremarkable species, and they only counted the beetles they found. But they found almost 1,000 different species called the canopies of those trees home. Redwood trees can be so huge that their branches host little forests of their own. including worms and salamanders that will never touch the ground, and even entire trees of different species growing in the soil that the redwoods hold up. One reason it's crucial not to just look at individual plants in isolation is that plants are almost never truly isolated in nature. They're woven together in marvelous ways, as this brilliant short video from the BBC showcases.
Trees may look like solitary individuals, but the ground beneath our feet tells a different story. Trees are secretly talking, trading, and waging war on one another. They do this using a network of fungi that grow around and inside their roots. The fungi provide the trees with nutrients, and in return they receive sugars. But scientists have found this connection runs far deeper than first thought. By plugging into the fungal network, trees can share resources with each other. The system has been nicknamed the Wood Wide Web. It's thought that older trees, fondly known as mother trees, use this fungal network to supply shaded seedlings with sugars, giving them a better chance of survival. Those trees that are sick or dying may dump their resources into the network, which might then be used by healthier neighbours. Plants also use fungi to send messages to one another. If they're attacked, they can release chemical signals through their roots, which can warn their neighbours to raise their defences. But like our internet, the Wood Wide Web has its dark side too. Some orchids hack the system to steal resources from nearby trees. And other species, like the black walnut, spread toxic chemicals through the network to sabotage their rivals. Arboreal cybercrime aside, scientists are still debating why plants seem to behave in such an altruistic way. The hidden network creates a thriving community between individuals. When you're next in woodland, you might like to think of trees as part of a big superorganism, chatting and swapping information and food under your feet.
Clearly, plants can care for each other, and they can also care for us. But I want to close out this talk by thinking a bit about how we can care for them. Plants are individually incredible. Together, they can communicate, coordinate, form and sustain communities. And yet I bet that you and I use the same hard, unfeeling word for all of them, from pando to pollen and rainforests to your front garden. It. It is a numb word, a dead word, a word for inanimate things, not living beings. I'd use it for the wall of my house or the plastic on my keyboard. I'd be in huge trouble if I called it a stranger, much less a colleague, a friend, my wife or my son, it. Even my parents' cat is a she, not an it. With everything we've looked at in this talk so far, it just doesn't seem right to use that same it for plants. But this is an inbuilt feature of the English language. It's one you may never have noticed before, and it colours the way we look at the world. It's a small hint of the biases we all have when it comes to the natural world. And it's one reason why it's so important that we learn from other cultures when it comes to appreciating and looking after plants. Perhaps the most important people we need to listen to are the world's indigenous communities. Indigenous people own, manage, use or occupy about a quarter of land on Earth. As a result, that quarter is generally doing better than the rest. Indigenous people can bring incredible insights to ecosystems that they've known and observed for, in some cases, many thousands of years. Lots of the plant-based products we looked at earlier in this talk started out as things Indigenous people knew. But more than this, Indigenous worldviews can show us different, less harmful ways of relating with nature. For example, one Indigenous solution to the it problem in the English language comes from Robin Wall Kimmerer, a Potawatomi woman and a professor in the US. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she highlights how different the world seems when we don't use it for living things. The Potawatomi word, Akibmadiziwin, means being of the living earth. Out of that, Professor Kimmerer takes the word ki, which she suggests could replace it. For instance, I love that blackbird. Ki always sings from this tree in the evenings, or Ki's my favourite plant in my garden. Now, those phrases feel a little bit weird for me, but that's kind of the point. They make me think differently about the living things. beings, kin, around me. Sadly, many countries' dominant societies have a very poor track record of respecting indigenous ways of life, and the church has often been a major cause of harm, not help. Misplaced and arrogant desires to civilize savage people have led to abuses and atrocities aimed at separating indigenous people from their cultures and languages, from Canada's church-run residential schools to the state-sponsored kidnapping of Australia's stolen generation. So in light of that, I want to highlight 3 ways we can fail to care for plants. When we forget how important plants are, when we focus too much on the things we want that plants can give us, and when we override the indigenous people who can care for them best. When we fail in these ways, injustice and destruction tend to follow. And we can start just down the road. The UK's HS2 project is destroying dozens of irreplaceable ancient woodlands, a sign that their importance is being ignored. Similarly, in Paraguay, cattle ranching is destroying precious habitats and encroaching on the territories of indigenous people who resisted contact with wider society, all in order to make leather for luxury European cars. Desire for plant-based things fueled the Atlantic slave trade, cheap labor for Caribbean sugar plantations, and it fueled the American Civil War. People wanted it, and the South wanted enslaved black people to work on cotton plantations. At the turn of the 20th century, greed for natural rubber, coupled with disregard for indigenous people, led to appalling atrocities on both sides of the Atlantic. The Amazon rubber boom and Africa's Congo Free State together saw millions enslaved, tortured, mutilated, and murdered in pursuit of profits for European-based companies. And again, we don't have to look so far from home here. The hazelnuts and palm oil used to make the Nutella that I had for my breakfast this morning can be linked to the exploitation of refugee children in Turkey and low-paid workers in Indonesia. So what do we need to do as individuals, communities, churches to guard against these failings and help truly care for plants? Well, we need to remember how important plants are and treasure them as living beings and communities, not just inanimate things, or sources of stuff that we want. In the biblical creation story, God gives man and woman all the plants in the Garden of Creation. He tells us to use them for food, but also to care for them. And we also need to stand up for indigenous and traditional people who know and care for plants best. Consider these church forests in Ethiopia. They're refuges for biodiversity and little cared-for islands of nature in an unwelcoming sea of agricultural land. Consider Alice Seeley Harris, the Baptist missionary who helped alert the world to the atrocities in Congo Free State, or the Anglicans and Quakers who worked to abolish the Atlantic slave trade. We need to be working to emulate these people, these places, in our relationships with plants. Now, hopefully, listening to this talk has been a useful first step towards that for you. And there are a few things you can consider doing next. In terms of respecting people, as well as educating yourself on human rights, we can also look for things that are fair trade or have more sustainable components, especially things like palm oil. A little bit more green in your life you can get from Plant Life. And they've got a number of initiatives that can help, from promoting wilder road verges to supporting pollinators with your lawn. To help you notice and get to know the plants around you, consider using an ID app on your phone. I've been using this one, and it's called Seek by iNaturalist. It's very good, though it's not quite perfect. It's a great way to connect with nature in your neighborhood. You've tried just planting something, even if only an apple pip, and let yourself enjoy the wonder of a plant rising up from the soil as it will have done for hundreds of millions of years. And have a think about which stories and examples have grabbed you from this talk, and act on them. Do some Googling, follow them up. Nurture that spark. I said right at the start of this talk that I'm a massive plant nerd. I hope, as I finish, that you can see I was right. But I also hope that you've been able to catch a sense of why I care so much about plants. I hope I've been able to lift the lid on their amazing world for you, and that you come away from this talk with a new appreciation for the plants all around us, and some ideas about how you can help them as they help you from now on. Thank you for listening.